And we shouldn't just think about the brain, but we've got the whole peripheral system. He's quite into pain.
I love pain.
He's come here falling down the stairs. He gave a talk on quantum torture a few years ago. Fell down the stairs before doing it. Yeah. So he's an expert on...
Mock the quantum gods.
Yeah. So...
Okay, surprised it's me again. Okay, I want to be very quick so that people can go for dinner and drinks and so on. I don't want to be the one in between you and a drink. So I'm just going to go briefly. So I think before I've been discussing the body and basic ways of sensing the body and how that plays a role in acting. So once you go beyond that, you have the idea that you have very many other forms of bodily awareness which are more complex, like interoception, ownership, agency, which Matt just now was calling the sense of agency, which he was calling the sense of ownership of your actions, and the vestibular sense. And I think a full account of the importance of embodiment in action has to also cover these cases and not only the base case. And you get interesting dissociations once you look at these cases. So now I'm just going to talk about ownership. Tomorrow we'll talk about balance. So if you look at the actual literature on ownership, it's really, really messy. People look like they're discussing different things. There's a lot of crosstalk. The terminology is a mess. The empirical people pretend they're talking to the philosophical people and vice versa, but actually everyone is talking past each other. So it's not even quite clear what they are theorizing about. So in order to deal with that, I think in order to initiate such a discussion, we need 3 anchor points for such work. And I should also say that this is joint work with Christina, who's sitting here. The 3 anchor points are these. Okay, the first anchor point is that there are disorders of body ownership. Okay, so this is somatoparaphrenia. Typically, you have it when you have a kind of right hemispheric lesion, and they deny ownership of some part of the body. So here's a patient. Here's a vignette. Patient says, "That's not my hand. It's not mine. Someone left it there. Don't know who he was. I don't know who attached it to my body." So these patients are otherwise not crazy. This delusion is very specific. It's quite persistent. Okay? So this is one anchor point. That there are cases of pathologies of ownership. Second anchor point is a phenomenological observation. In fact, each of these anchor points was one point of departure for the literature, but they're often not brought together. So this was the point of departure for Michael Martin's discussion of these issues, which is the phenomenology of located bodily sensation. So if you've been sitting too long, I think Jed just started.
I have a herniated disc, which is why I move so much, sir.
No, you just started scratching because...
Perfect, right?
Yeah, perfect. When you feel a located bodily sensation, you don't only feel it to be located, but you feel it to be located in a part of your body, within your bodily boundaries, okay? So, for example, you feel an itch in your body, a pain in your body, and so on and so forth. And this is also true for phantom sensation. You feel it to be in a seeming part of your body, okay? That seems to be a phenomenological datum. And the third anchor point, I think, is important, is the recent stuff on the rubber hand illusion and the full body versions of this, so that you have the possibility to empirically induce these illusions. You can do it via vision and touch, or just via haptics and other forms of doing this. So in these cases, you have apparently the ability to induce a sense of ownership over some kind of foreign body or body part, and typically you have an objective measure. proprioceptive judgment or some kind of defense measure, like how much you sweat in response to a trend, for example. That's called skin conductance. Okay. And that's correlated with some kind of subjective report like questionnaire. So if you look at the questionnaires, this is the questionnaire from the original Nature paper, and the important items are these. I felt as if the rubber hand were my hand, and you see there's quite strong agreement. The other items where you have agreement are, the first is that you feel the touch to be where you see it to be. Okay, you feel the touch to be where you see it to be. It's a bit unusual because in the case of the rubber hand, the brush is on the rubber hand. Okay, the rubber hand is not your hand. Your hand is being simultaneously brushed, but you feel the touch to be where you see it to be. Okay. Okay, good. Good. So these are the three anchor points, and I think any account of ownership has to do justice to these different things and bring them together. Okay. So one of the major problems in the current literature, I think, is that people haven't distinguished different questions about ownership. They're actually very different questions about ownership. And if you look at criticisms of different accounts, they actually criticize each other for using one type of account for a different type of question. So that's one of the issues. So the five questions, I think, are: first, there's a phenomenological question. What is it like to own your body? Second, there's a constitutive question. What is body ownership? What's the nature of body ownership? Third, there's a mechanistic causal question. What brings about body ownership? There's a functional question. What can body ownership do? What is its function? And fifth, there's a mereological question that relates to full body ownership and its connection to ownership over body parts. How does ownership of parts relate to ownership of the whole body? And so, for example, a lot of philosophical accounts have concentrated on questions 1 and 2 and have treated them as intrinsically linked. Some of the accounts treat them as intrinsically linked in such a way that no empirical stuff could possibly challenge them, because it's just a constitutive account based on the phenomenology. Some other accounts have brought together causal stuff and read causal conditions as constitutive of the rubber hand illusion, and then claim that it's consistent with the phenomenology that they want. So, for example, Frederick Devinemont's account has that shape, and so on and so forth. So you see people giving accounts crisscrossing the different kinds of questions, and this partly explains the kind of mess that you get. Once you have this map of questions, then you can then be clearer about what exactly you're doing. So typically the scientists are interested in this question, the causal question: what are the mechanisms? So when they say multi-sensory integration plus body models is the key mechanism for ownership, this is the question that they're answering. The constitutive question, sometimes people answer in terms of, for example, Martin's account is a constitutive account that draws on the phenomenology. Another constitutive account that draws on the phenomenology is the kind of Gallagher-Bjorn account, that there's just some kind of primitive first-person qualia. Now, a mixed account is, for example, Peacock's account, which is a first-person account added on to Devinemont's account. So Devinemont's account is that what's constitutive of ownership is representation in the body schema, and then Peacock's complaint is that that's not first-personal enough. So let's add some first-person Peacocky elements into the body schema. So that's sort of trying to run together 1, 2, and 3. And it's a question whether that kind of strategy could really be successful in this kind of instance. Do you have PowerPoint?
I don't. But
I
maybe
do.
hear people.
This is there are different Macs. So this is
That's mine. It's really nice. Now I'm going to take it.
this is it. Yeah.
This won't work.
This is good. I think this is good. Right. There was another thought. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, that's good. Good. Okay, so these are the different accounts, and I think I won't go through the different accounts because we're short of time, and I'm much more interested in hearing Ishvan's killer objections to everything. So I'll just assume you know the accounts. If you don't know accounts, we can discuss it. And I'm just going to jump ahead to the account that Christina and I have developed. And it's not really an account, but it's the shape of an account. Okay? Sorry, so I'm cheating there. Okay. So the two things we want to say. One is we want to ask what's the target of phenomenological explanation. And the other thing is about whole body ownership, but we won't discuss that. And I think it's very important to get the target right. So I think we think that the explanatory target of theorizing isn't clear. And in particular, I think the most important question is whether there is a first personal element in the sense of body ownership. Okay, I think this is the most important question. And then the next question is whether this is in the experience or in the judgment. Okay, I think this is the central question. And I mean, theories of a certain stripe see the importance of this question, but theories of another stripe think that they can put first personal elements everywhere. So I think this is very important to be clear about. Now, in particular, it's important to be clear about that because if the target of phenomenological explanation is not unequivocally first personal experiences of body ownership, then we have to come up with what the target is and what are the necessary components. So is it spatial, is it reflective, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is very important. Now, what are possible ways of proceeding? Okay, three possible ways. One is to do classical phenomenology. Characterize what it's like based on introspection and everyday experience. That's very hard. Basically, we've been sitting around for years and years, and it's only recently that we even discovered that we have this thing called ownership, if that was a discovery at all. So this is going to be very difficult. Maybe there's some psychological methods. So for example, Matthew Longo has done a very nice large-scale study with 40 questions on the rubber hand illusion, and basically he had, I think, about 100 participants, and then he could do principal components analysis. And based on that, he could then discern major components of the experience. And that's an empirical way of doing phenomenology, and quite interesting. So that may be promising, but it's very hard to just introspect and do that. Second thing is to use pathologies to infer what is present in the case of healthy individuals. This is very dangerous because from the fact that you have a sense of alien phenomenology in the bad case, it doesn't follow that there is even a positive phenomenology in the normal case. It doesn't follow. So it's not some kind of deductive inference. It has to be by some kind of inference to the best explanation, and it's going to be very hard to use this strategy. It could be part of a triangulated strategy, but it's going to be very hard to use this deductively. The third strategy is the kind of strategy that some scientists have used, and Peacock, I think, jumped on this bandwagon recently in the analysis symposium on his self book. And this is the idea of using the rubber hand illusion paradigm to pin down the phenomenology of body ownership. And based on this, he wants to claim that in the case of the rubber hand illusion, there's a distinctive feeling that the hand is his, that it's mine when I'm experiencing it first personally, and it also has these spatial and affective components. Okay, in response to that, the problem is that the rubber hand illusion case is an unusual case, it may be involving surprise and so on and so forth. And from the fact that it's an unusual case, it's going to be hard to infer that this is generally present. So it might be, you might have the phenomenology because it's an unusual case. Okay, so those are the general things. Another thing to think about is whether this is ownership is only something in the human case and the human adult case kind of question that Jed would address, or something that is more pervasive. So Mano Sakiris, when he used to give talks, he used to introduce ownership talks by showing this YouTube video of the dog chasing his alien paw. I think a lot of people must have seen this. Have people seen this video? You can check it on YouTube. It's not clear whether it's an anarchic paw syndrome or a case of alien paw syndrome. So if it's an anarchic paw syndrome, then it's because the hand is anarchic and the dog is disturbed because the paw is doing things that he doesn't want it to do. If it's alien paw syndrome, then he's feeling that the paw is not part of his body. Okay, and that's why he's chasing it. It may coincide, so it's not clear what the YouTube video shows. But here is a recent piece of very rigorous research. Rigorous because it's published in Journal of Neuroscience, which is a stickler for details, and Japanese group doing the rubber tail illusion. This is what Japanese science is paying. So in the rubber tail illusion, they put the mouse into this little vestibule, and then there's a rubber tail here. And then the tail can be stroked synchronously or asynchronously. Okay, and you get results, and the mice see that the tail is being stroked, and you get results that are indicative of the human results. Okay, track responses based on ownership and so on and so forth. Okay, if this is an induction of ownership phenomenology, then it doesn't seem to require the first person. It may require the first mouse. Or first animal. Okay, so this is okay. Good. So that's about the target of phenomenological explanation. Just going to jump straight to the jugular. So we think that the shape of an account of ownership is as follows. There are two levels. The first level is what you call what we call self-significant experiences of one's body. So it can be extremely pluralistic about the types of experiences involved, as long as they have this kind of self-specificity. Okay, and it may involve spatial, agentive, affective aspects. At this level of self-specific experience, and I'll say in a moment what self-specificity comes to. There is as yet no first personal element in these experiences, okay? And they are self-significant to the extent that they're integrated in perception and action. Okay, so now I'm going to say roughly what self-specificity is. So, self-specific information is information which is just about yourself. Okay, so far it's at the level of information, and it becomes what we call self-significant when it's integrated into the perception and action of the subject with that body. Okay, so this is an Evansian account in a way. Now, and what's the criteria for reaching self-significance? We use a behavioral criteria, drawing on these discussions of essential indexicality and so on and so forth. The idea is that when you have self-significance, that's reflected in these experiences having what Campbell says, immediate implications for action. Okay, and this explains various behavioral contrasts. So, for example, the contrast between the shark swimming toward me here versus the shark swimming there towards Ishmael. Okay, so we have very different actions. Fire here on my trousers versus fire there on Ishmael's trousers. Okay, or fire there on the trousers of the guy I see in reflected in the window. Okay, so that contrast, capturing that contrast gives us self-significance. Now, once we have that, we can recognize that this notion can come in a range of experiences. It can be in bodily experiences, it can be in visual experiences, it can involve agentive experiences, can involve forms of affect, can be involved in self-defense, and so on and so forth. So at the first level, experiences of ownership can be extremely diverse. Okay? So with that, we can capture, so I'm saying that this is the shape of an account rather than an account. Because in all extant accounts, what people have done is gone for one type of feature and said that's essential for all cases, necessary and sufficient. So it might be spatial, affective, defensive, agentive, or so on and so forth. We think that a lot of these things are involved in different cases, and I think we think that the key core is self-specificity and integration. And because many different types of experiences could be self-specific, we want to allow for that plurality in principle. Okay, if that's so, then this kind of self-significance, capturing the kind of psychology behind essential indexicality, could be present in non-human animals, like mice or cats and so on and so forth. So the thought is that this is the first layer and provides for a phenomenology of body ownership. Second layer is where the first person properly comes in, where there's really a first person. And these are judgments of ownership, and you have first person content through self-attribution. So in self-conscious creatures, then you have the further possibility of integration through grasp of the self-significance of the body in perception and action, which then allows for self-attribution. And then the first person content enters through judgments, that something is felt to be mine or part of my body. So that's the two-layered account. You have plurality of self-significant experiences, and the first person is entering at the next level. Okay. So in terms of Dere, they say, and stuff like that, depending on your account of the they say, the first level may not be fully they say. It might be a cross between a full they say and a half they say. It really depends on your account of they say, but whatever is capturing the psychology of essential indexicality is playing the role there. And the second level is where you have judgments of ownership. Okay. Okay, I think I will stop there. So that's the account of the shape, the shape of an account of ownership. Thank you. You have to direct VGA, Nick.
Anyone can help us with connecting?
Oh, just a moment.
It just goes in the VGA, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That's a departmental machine, yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
That's why I'm
Maybe let's.
trying to take some responsibility. Oh, there's no,
Because
nothing
it's the
to
last
screw in,
floor.
you just have to plug it in.
We don't just have video, we
Well,
have
this is-
audio.
Where's the, oh, okay.
You'll find out.
They don't have that. Is that what you do?
Yeah, is that
Okay.
okay? So I'll try to be fast so we can go eat and drink. So actually it's quite nice that by chance the parts that you chose not to talk about are the parts that I chose not to talk about, and the part that you chose to talk about is the first part of what I'm going to talk about. So this is comments on Hong Yu and Christina's paper, The Sense of Body Ownership, What Are We Studying? So it is the structure of what I'm going to say. So first, some critical remarks on their use of terms such as first person and self-significant, as well as their insistence on including the narrative self, usually it's called the narrative self, as a layer in the construction of body ownership or integration of body ownership. So this is the second layer that you just mentioned now. Second, some info about what I take to be two key experimental areas for understanding what we are talking about when we analyze body ownership, which these are not present in the chapter or in this paper, but I think they are quite cool and interesting and relevant. So one is immersive virtual reality and one is psychedelic drugs. And some conclusions, some very quick and philosophical conclusions derived from these experiments regarding the way we should think about body ownership. Okay, so first, self-person, first-person perspective. So following Peacock, Hong Yu and Christina, they use the term first person in a kind of very loaded way. I think roughly as self-conscious, right? So only self-conscious animals would have first person, would qualify as having truly or genuinely first person content. So here's a quote from them. So second, there's a question whether ownership experiences must be first person. One way to probe this is to ask whether ownership experiences might be self-specific or self-significant experiences, but fall short of a first-person sui generis experience of ownership. Okay, there is some evidence that non-human animals may experience ownership of an artificial limb after synchronous stimulation. In a recent study, the rubber tail illusion was induced in mice. Okay, so after synchronous but not asynchronous stimulation of the rubber tail, the mice responded to the grasping of the rubber tail as if it's their own tail. And in these cases, the induced experience is self-significant, but plausibly falls short of any first-person content. Okay, so two of the examples. So I have a problem with terminology, which I will say after this slide something about it, but maybe it's just merely terminological. But there are two cases that they use, I think, to motivate the existence of this second layer. One is somatoparaphrenia, which you mentioned, and one is apotemnophilia/BID. They are different, distinct conditions, so body identity, integrity disorder. But since I think Peacock runs them together, and then you run them together, I will run them together. So here, these are given as reasons for having to accept 2 layers of integrations when it comes to body ownership. So as we saw before, lower level layer is having to do with multisensory, somatosensory, and sensory motor processes, and the higher level layer having to do with first-person integration, okay, explicit self-ascription. Now, in reply, so somatoparaphrenia is most likely explained by proprioceptive deficits. So there is no need to take, self-consciousness as playing an essential role in the feeling of ownership. Given that I assume that it is really the feeling of ownership that we are after. Now, of course, it was very nice that you distinguished 5 questions, right? The types of questions. But probably it is the feeling of ownership rather than the judgment that I guess people are really, interested in when it comes to, when we use the term body ownership. So now if it's, it's proprioceptive deficits, then basically you don't really need to care so much about the judgment itself. If you can explain it by this first order, simple deficiency. Now, apotemnophilia, this is, is doubtful whether we should take reports at face value when they concern the phenomenology of
What is that? Hemophilia?
Apotemnophilia.
Love of amputation.
Amputation, yeah. It's kind of obsession with them.
Oh, these are the people who want
Amputate,
okay.
yeah.
Who actually have healthy limbs, but they want to amputate parts of themselves.
Yeah, so when it comes to, in the first case, we say, okay, we could assume and take at face value what they say, because what they say, it's, it's alien to me, it's not my hand, and so on. Now, in this case, I think it's doubtful whether we could take the reported phenomenology of disownership at face value, since the disturbance is an aberrant higher cognitive attitude, usually coupled with sexual fetishism. Hence, it does not have to involve ownership phenomenology, right? And actually, there are many of these people, even just the BID people, not apotemnophilia, they actually force themselves, they use crutches. They use that for months or for years. And artificial, they don't, it's not that, some people think that, it's not, the reports are not true, that there is anything like disownership. It's just like it's an aberrant interpretation of something that feels your own, but you don't want it to be there.
No, I think we should wait.
Okay, so that's one point. Now, second, the use of self. So, Hong Yu and Christina many times refer to self-significance and even define certain terms by reference to it, for example, experiential embodiment and experience of ownership. I think there's a danger of circularity here. So in a long phenomenological tradition, Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, Gallagher, we are our bodies, like the lip body, the lime, right? So there is a notion of body that is kind of constitutive of the self, or maybe even identical to the self. If we try to define body ownership via self-significance, this will be circular unless we have a less loaded notion of self, right? Something like a more minimalist notion of self, right? Now, the less loaded notion of self, I suggest as useful, is the notion of first-person perspective, 1pp, right? So this is different from what they refer to as genuine first-person content. It consists of a basic location index, a place in space and time from which things seem a certain way. And I mean, is the kind of place in time, space and time, that's not third person and second person, okay? How things seem from here, the way I see my body, actually, a normal case. So non-self-conscious animals have it too, in that sense. No, they have first-person perspective, no doubt about that. Now, 1pp will integrate in healthy subjects their anatomical body, since that body will be one of the things that appear a certain way from first-person perspective, visually, proprioceptively, etc. But there's empirical evidence that the anatomical body is very easy to dissociate from the first-person perspective, and correlatively that it is easy to adopt other bodies, even anatomically incongruent ones, or even the neutral environment. So I'm going to present two such types of phenomena, which maybe they tell us something important about ownership. One is immersive virtual reality, one is a drug experience. Okay, so this is Jaron Lanier, who coined the term virtual reality in 1985, and he also had a lab where they experimented. This is the famous glove, the data glove that he invented, and from then on, nowadays there's an explosion of virtual reality, because now it became commercially available, the headset and so on.
Like Dave Chalmers.
Yeah. So here is Lanier, who reports what they were doing in the 80s already. I hope we'll have sound.
Now you can actually measure everything your body's doing without wearing one of these suits. That's never been true before. So suddenly, the avatar experience can open up. Now, why is that a big deal? In order to begin to explain that, I will tell you about a bug that occurred in our, well, I could call it our lab, but it was really a garage in Palo Alto, as it always is, almost 30 years ago. I was an avatar, I think just something humanoid, something boring, and accidentally my hand was a mile long. Just one of these typical bugs. There's probably only one, extra zero. I curled my finger, and suddenly this gigantic finger swooped in and swallowed me, and I was inside my fingertip. And so, the first thing one thinks is, well, this will be a good story, but let's fix it and move on. But something very interesting happened. People in the garage started playing with distorted avatars and discovered something extraordinary, which is that you can be a really weirdly shaped avatar and still control your avatar body quite well. You can instantly adapt to weird body shapes. And so then we got interested in this question of, well, how weird can they get? And we started turning into all kinds of different animals and aliens and weird fantasy creatures. And some of them didn't work, some of them did. A famous early one was designed by a woman named Anne Lesko that was a lobster. And the thing about lobsters, if you've ever taken a close look at them, they have extra arms. There's these 3 little arms on the side. And there's this question, well, how would you control them with just your physical body? That's all you have to start with to control an avatar. And it turns out by pulling bits of data from different parts of your body and combining them, like just a little bit of wrist, a little bit of ankle, a little bit of hip to control, say, the middle of the middle arm joints on the left side, you could suddenly learn to control extra limbs, which is really pretty strange.
Okay, so this is all about control. So here are some, this is the event lab at University of Barcelona. They are doing a lot of experiments on avatars. so virtual reality. And so here are some examples. Embodiment with various avatar types. So adult subject into sex-matched 4-year-old human subject. White subject into black body, extra long arms, extra large belly. Non-speaking subject into speaking avatar. And effects. And these effects occur quite quickly, right? That's why it's interesting. So quick adoption of bodily features of the avatar, ownership. Relational effects, overestimation of object size in the VR environment. This is a child experiment. Changes in implicit attitudes. So 4-year-old attitudinal features tested via implicit attitudinal test. Reduction of implicit bias towards persons of color. So very interesting effects that don't only have to do with the body and adopting the body, but of all sorts of other higher level changes. So this experiment, being white man being embodied into a black man's body. This is very nice. This is his real belly. This is the simulated belly. You see, this is first-person perspective, and the experiment involves tapping on your belly via this stick. And so they, after a while, people report that, this is my belly. It's huge. Right? So here's another short. These are shorter videos, just 1 minute. This is the child video.
Veo una mesa justo enfrente de mí. Hay un sofá con unas almohadas. Veo a una niña en el espejo, se está moviendo las manos.
So this is the implicit attitude test, association test. Okay, so
representing that in virtual
this is the
reality.
guy who's doing the experiment.
One example of this idea of virtual embodiment is that we used it to make concrete this fact that people talk to themselves. So we all talk to ourselves on the inside, but imagine who I'm talking to is externalized as another person. So what we do is we take people, we scan their real body, so we have a likeness of their real body, and on the other side of the virtual room they see another person. For example, it could be somebody like Sigmund Freud, it could be Einstein, it could be anybody. They explain their problems to the person on the other side. Then after that, they are the person on the other side. So when they look at themselves, they see, I am now in the body of Freud, or I'm now in the body of Einstein. And they see and hear themselves, their previous incarnation, say the problem, and now as Freud or Einstein, they say, well, I think you could address the problem this way. And then they're back in their own body and they hear with a disguised voice, Freud or Einstein, tell them how to address this problem. And they can keep switching between the two bodies until they reach a resolution. So this is this example of what we call virtual reality self-talk. We objectify the talking to yourself by talking to another virtual character who is also you.
We have a company if you want to buy headsets.
Yeah, right.
Virtual body work. Let your virtual body work for you if you are interested. So the second type of field is this one. So recent research on LSD, psilocybin, magic mushrooms has been focused on the neural underpinning of so-called ego dissolution. That is reports of becoming one with the world, depersonalization, and derealization, losing one's individuality, particularity. These are quite frequent reports for these and other drugs. So this is basically, these are official names: oceanic boundlessness, dread of ego dissolution. They are basically the same experience of ego dissolution, but with positive versus negative. That's positive attitude towards it. It's a nice feeling. I become one with the world or nature. And it's the kind of bad, sorry, it should be bad trip here. This is the kind of bad trip. And the difference between and the phenomenology is quite similar, except because of the emotional charge that's different in them. In this case, you feel like it's so nice because I'm losing my individuality. Whereas in this case, kind of they get scared that they start not being able to control their body anymore. So the whole body actually disappears. I got a little Pink Floyd. Early Pink Floyd.
I want to tell you a story.
Okay, so psychedelic experience is a form of enhanced consciousness, so the kind of polar opposite of coma. Psychedelic and unconscious states occupy polar opposite ends of a spectrum of conscious states, defined by their level of entropy or randomness. Okay. Now, second thing is dose dependency of ED, okay, ego dissolution. It's almost linear. Some people, other people report it's kind of inverse U-shaped, but there is a dependency that's important. And at the neural level, so there's increased global connectivity, intermodule crosstalk, that is modules that normally do not interact. They start interacting, and there's crosstalk between them. So this is a default mode network, which is the network that works when you are just not acting, lying down. And so people relate DMN to the narrative self, because that's the situation in which you are tempted to think about yourself and have, memories that have to do, with your experiences and so on. And then we have the task positive network that has to do with action, and that's active when you are, moving around and have some goals. And so what happens is, one thing that they found is basically there is this decrease in DMN, TPN inverse coupling, okay, this inverse correlation. And also in Vedic and Chinese traditions, certain meditation techniques, you see the same thing. So basically, what happens is, because these two modules start not being inversely correlated, it is as if you are both acting, but outside your body or out there in the world without having a kind of embodied existence. The temporal parietal junction, this seems to be a very interesting region, because it seems to be involved in certain first-person perspective and body ownership-related exotic phenomena. So one is out-of-body experiences, one is dreamy states, one is inversion of the body part versus neutral object relationship in the classic rubber hand illusion. So in the classic rubber hand illusion, basically, you won't have the illusion if it's not a rubber hand, but it's just a neutral object. That's not a hand or something like that. And interestingly enough, if you stimulate the TPN, the TPJ, you get exactly the inverse of that, right? So at least you get you lose the distinction whether it's body part or not. And psychedelic states of ego world boundary dissolution, also this can be generated by stimulation. So some conclusions very quickly. Okay, so body ownership is cheap, okay? Compared to the body schema, okay, understood the way Gallagher describes it in his book and his previous articles. Body ownership is easily manipulatable. I can manipulate it easily. So not only visual tactile, like in the original rubber hand experiment, but also visual motor, visual proprioceptive, and visual interoceptive synchrony is sufficient to create illusions of ownership, right? A body ownership is not basic, fundamental, primitive. It is most likely a byproduct of action possibilities in the context of multisensory stimulation. So in virtual reality, it is motor control over the avatar that generates ownership transfer from the anatomical body to the virtual one, and constraining possibilities of action for the anatomical body causes quicker adoption of a rubber hand. So these are recent studies. One study is on hemiplegic patients. They are more prone to this rubber hand illusion, and also people who've been immobilized for a while with a cast, they are more prone to the illusion, right? Which means that your body ownership is less anchored now into your anatomical body because of lack of action possibilities. Right? Thirdly, and I think finally, the last one, I think, body ownership is virtual all the way, okay? So explanatory parsimony requires us to hypothesize that the mechanism by which we adopt virtual bodies and rubber hands should be the very same, which is responsible for our anatomical embodiment and feeling of body ownership. Actually, at this point, I think this point is quite congenial to your idea of experiential embodiment as compared to the other types of embodiment, right? Therefore, strictly speaking, it's not correct to call cases of, rubber hand illusion and virtual body adoption illusions of embodiment, because what happens in those cases the same phenomenon as in the standard case of embodiment into our anatomically given bodies. Now, related to this, of course, you mentioned this, however much you will stare at your hands, you won't get body ownership. It will be recessive rather than, occurrent, and therefore, only in very artificial cases like rubber hand illusion, you will have that feeling of ownership. I think that's not a problem because, your hands, they are always there in your peripheral vision. And the same thing would happen if a rubber hand was always there, right? So I think the cases are really similar. Of course, it's not very useful. You can't do much phenomenology with that. In virtual reality are also reported. So what difference would it make if instead of avatars we could connect anatomical bodies to the sensory motor systems, other anatomical bodies, right? There's no difference of principle. Basically, it's just more difficult. It's hard to get bodies real. It's easier to build virtual bodies. But if we had bodies, you could connect me to 100 bodies, and I could control 100 bodies, and it would be the same. So in that sense, I think it's how anchored it is in the anatomical body. I think it's not. Okay, actually we can discuss what to say about it. In a way, it's not very anchored given that it's easy to adopt other bodies, but on the other hand, given multisensory integration, which happens just so naturally with your anatomical body in a healthy subject, then it's quite anchored, given that you affect a lot of actions and so on. Okay, so with that, thanks for your attention. That's Avatar the movie.
Thanks, Ishmael. Do you want to come up, Christine?
Can I just say a small thing? So, there is difficulty in saying that ownership is the same from first-person perspective and from third-person perspective. So, somatoparaphonic patient is some of Footopoulous work on it. So some of the somatoparaphonic patients disown the left hand, and then they show a mirror to them and ask whether that hand, the left hand, is their hand, and they say yes. So, somatoparaphenia doesn't go to third-person perspective on yourself. It just stays with the first person. And there is another, so we are actually designing an experiment which was done, but it wasn't published because negative results weren't welcome in the old time, that they tried out the out-of-body illusion with person. So there was a real person and another person and tried out-of-body. Doesn't work. So the problem is that the first person, third person is a really big gap. And when you have many kind of effects, then always when you have a first person version and the third person version, they are very different. So that jump which you want to make might not be something which we can make.
I agree with that about the concrete person. So you want it to be virtual all the way down and so on and so forth. So I think that there are kind of two kinds of cases. One type of case is the Dennett Ware-My type of case, which you augmented with many bodies too, and so on. So we can discuss how we should interpret those kinds of cases, whether it's embodiment or something strange happens with the metaphysics, and how neutral the descriptions can be in those situations. But I think in a way it's very cheap, and in a way it's not so cheap. And in the way in which it's very cheap is that it's very, you can induce these kinds of experiences really, really quickly and cheaply, and with very poor equipment even. So the Slater lab is the most advanced VR lab in the world, and they do everything to ensure that you have the best avatar experience possible. So it's very easy for people to embody an avatar. I mean, in one of the experiments, you get stroking such that you embody this avatar, and then something very unusual happens. A woman comes and slaps you across the face, and people have this incredibly visceral reaction. So it's really striking. Now, the funny thing is you have those cases, but you also have cases of people who cannot accept hand transplants, limb transplants, and so on and so forth. So in a way, it can be very hard. So there are instances which are very easy. You can have a very fast kind of switch over such that you have incorporation, but lots of more permanent cases are very, very difficult as well. So you have a kind of duality between, plasticity on the one hand and some kind of stubbornness on the part of body representations to adjust. So a lot of phantom limb sufferers suffer from phantom limb for their whole lives, and it's just very hard to correct. So based on that, there still seems to be something important in the biological hardwiring, even if the virtual stuff is quite easy to incorporate. And then there was some, can I use your slides?
Sure.
There were a couple of slides in the beginning.
Yeah, the slides about
So about this, about somatoparaphrenia and body identity integrity disorder. So you have double dissociations between proprioceptive deficits and somatoparaphrenia. So you can't only explain it through proprioceptive deficits, because there are cases of people whose proprioception is relatively intact and they still have somatoparaphrenia. So the problem is you have all kinds of double dissociations. But I do agree that if it could just be explained by proprioceptive deficits, then they would be fine.
Yeah, so I don't know if there's something more recent than this.
Yeah, in this paper actually you can find the double dissociations. Okay. Yeah. So, but most cases involve proprioceptive deficits.
Yeah.
But so usually there's a combination of touch deficits and proprioceptive deficits. But you can also find patients who have relatively intact touch and proprioception. So there's a whole range of cases. You can see this from the fact that the lesion is very disunified. So they have a very fixed delusion here, monothematic delusion, but yet the site of the lesion is the entire right hemisphere, so you just have many different kinds of injury here. But I completely agree that there's no need to take self-consciousness as playing an essential role in the feeling of ownership. So there I think we're on the same side against people like Gallagher or Bjorn and so on and so forth, and maybe even Peacock. About apotemnophilia, I think I agree that it's very hard to take what they say. So currently it's an area of current interest, and apparently most of the best subjects to study are in Germany somehow, and they study them via web studies. So there are 3 diseases now that are related. One is apotemnophilia, the other one is body integrity identity disorder, and the other one is called xenomelia. And there are different hypotheses. The earliest hypothesis was a Freudian one, which has to do with that it's some kind of sexual paraphilia. And then more recently, you have a hypothesis from Ramachandran that it has to do with some neurological origin, because typically it's one side of the body. Typically it's males. It's normally under the knee, and also in some patients you find a difference in skin conductance under the point where they want to amputate. But generally, what the larger scale studies from Anna Berti's lab in Milan show is that it's not clear what the neurological damage is, and it's probably a mix of neurological, sociological, paraphilic, and so on and so forth, disorders. Yeah, so maybe you shouldn't use this case so much, but I think there are other cases where you can get the dissociation between feeling and judgment. Yes, one other thing about the first person perspective. I think we don't disagree in a way about using that as the minimal sense of self.
Big disagree.
We might have a disagreement between ourselves.
So the egocentric need not be carried out as first personal, and egocentric is something which we have. Animals have, babies have, but that is egocentric. And the first personal is a different thing, for us at least, but I think for most of the people in the literature, like egocentric is first personal, but there would be other which is first personal, which is not egocentric, and you can have egocentric, which is because there is no self-consciousness, not first personal. So the basic level would be egocentric, and that is which is shared by animals. And there is something first-person-ish in it, but it's not first-person.
Yeah, I understood that, and then I was just trying to kind of deflate, like, don't care so much about, because that's only about judgment.
Yeah.
There's a similar thing in the sense of agency literature, right?
So the egocentric is at the lower level
Yeah,
of
I know.
presence.
Yeah. So I mean, the sense of agency literature is the kind of, something similar. And sometimes people talk about, judgments rather than, and they say, oh, it's the sense. It's not the sense. It's the judgment. The Wigner book, for example.
Correct, yeah.
But then, my attitude to that is to say, well, let's not care about the judgments at all, right? Given that it's so high-level constructed kind of thing. But yeah, it's just that it's not really a disagreement. Just like I like that more.
I think we agree. So, but in a way, philosophically, it might be that the account is that what's substantive is that you don't care about the judgment. But that means that at the level of the philosophical account, the account you're giving is one of the judgment. Because you say there's these experiences which are special, blah, 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 that's interesting stuff. And the stuff that philosophers were talking about, which seemed really interesting, that's just the judgment stuff coming at the end. But I think one point of disagreement between the three of us is, so there are interesting discussions about the difference between first-person perspective, hear thought, and so on and so forth. So one question is whether it's they say or they hink. I mean, maybe hear thought can actually get you some of the effects, which was the self-significance in terms of, essential indexicality already. So there's one question whether hear thought already involves, first-person perspective or not.
Oh, I'm chairing. I forgot. Where's the chair? What's the chair doing?
Chair's just sitting.
Some other guy.
Again, thank you both very much. It's been really a fascinating afternoon. Also morning. I was quite concerned when we got to level 1 of the 2-level account. It's very hard to know how to phrase the relevant distinctions and phenomena, right? And so I was quite concerned by the phrase self-significant experiences of one's body. And that sounded much too self-conscious to get at the basic level that ought to be there. And I was relieved when I got to level 2, where you're talking about explicit judgments about one's own body and experience and whatever else. But I think this is one of those cases where issues about perception versus apperception and being very aware and very active in responding to what's happening in one's environs can involve, you know, where does it, you know, this is all happening around me, but without any kind of, certainly without self-conscious judgment of the type you've got at level 2, but I'm not so sure that self-significant experience of one's body captures the phenomena either. So let me tell you a bit about the phenomena. Some of this will come clear to you right away, I know, because the kinds of occasions that I have in mind, it can turn up in improvised avant-garde jazz, it can turn up in martial arts, and it turns up also in things like motor racing. And when one is involved in high stakes, very rapid activities, you cannot afford self-conscious judgments. Right? If you risk it, that's it. Right? Whatever you're trying to do, you can't do it anymore. And it may be the last thought you had. But in these kinds of activities, right, the level of, you know, perceptual awareness and proprioception is extraordinary. Right. Now, this is something that I've, you know, discussed with martial artists, and I know something about secondhand from jazz players. My own experience with motor racing. And it's very common. Anybody who's involved in motor racing long enough to get any good at it knows that when an accident is pending, right, the phenomenon of the rate of time change seems to just slow down. Right? It doesn't slow down, but your attention changes so much that you have extraordinarily detailed awareness of everything you can sense. And it's one of the things where what you're sensing of your own body and what you're sensing of the vehicle you're in, you don't distinguish. But it's extraordinarily intelligent activity, right? You know everything that's going on around you. You know everything that you can do. You know everything you had better not do if you don't want that pending accident to happen. All right? So where does that go between level 1 and level 2? Right? I mean, this phrase here, self-significant experience in one's own body, that sounds far too self-conscious to get at this kind of phenomenon, which is extraordinarily intelligent, extraordinarily skilled activity that is most definitely first person in terms of, you know, it's only you who's doing this, right? This is literally your point of view and your perspective in the midst of all this activity, whether it's music or auto racing or martial arts.
So I think we have a very deflationary understanding of self-significance, so we would be quite happy to absorb that in the first level. So insofar as it's then reflexive in terms of reflective in acquiring narrativity when you feel that time is slowing down and so on and so forth, then it will involve second level components. I mean, it depends on your account of experience itself.
Yes, but this is when I'm now not terribly happy with the phrasing that's been used in the slide. because I'm not sure what self-significant is supposed to be, especially not in connection with experiences and experiences of one's own body.
So the only criteria we're using is this Campbell criteria for capturing causal indexicality, this idea that it has immediate implications for action.
Yeah, well, I have a lot. This is exactly when my questions started. I want to know what he thinks of as immediate and what sorts of actions are relevant.
All kinds of. So he goes out to say that this notion can't be defined precisely, and it's kind of cashed out by different behavioral contrasts. So by the possibility of dodging, by the possibility of intelligent responses in different kinds of scenarios, based on incoming input that's relevant for you, as it were. And it's a behavioral notion that's in a way a primitive for him. He can't say more, except that drawn the idea that there's a contrast to be drawn here.
Okay.
Matt,
So,
did you want to come in on this?
No, different question.
My concern is the phrase starts out as experiences of ownership. No. There's total absorption in what one is doing. There's no experiences of ownership.
Well, they're not experiences of ownership in this other sense. Yes, that's right. Yeah, we agree.
But now you know why I'm very concerned about the way that.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So one way of responding is to say that we should regiment the language a little bit. But you're completely right that we would say that these cases of flow experience and so on and so forth, that now I can use my Hungarian, Csík said Mihai discussed, are precisely cases of self-significant experiences, even though they involve, ego dissolution and so on and so forth.
Or that kind of first-person self-reference is simply irrelevant. Right?
Yeah. Agreed.
Okay. So it's the phrasing there that I think I'm worried about.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And you didn't like self-significant either.
Yeah.
Maybe self-significant. Maybe you can find another
That's your
phrase.
specialty.
Because I think it's not clear what it means. It's significant for the self, significant to the self.
Now you have a Turkish problem.
Oh, yeah.
Not just Istanbul. Now it's all of Turkey.
I think I think maybe we could find. Yeah. But anyway, Matt.
So I just wanted to ask how your positive account fits with the use of tools and those sorts of body extensions. So on the one hand, I guess there's a sense in which tools can become self-significant. They can be used immediately for action and so on. But I guess they don't become self-significant in the way that in the rubber hand illusions you can become protective of the rubber hand in a way I don't think you become protective of tools that become extensions. So is there a point at which things do become felt to be part of the body or not, or is this a continuum? If it's a continuum, is it a continuum that affects parts of what we would normally think of as physical parts of the body, as well as tools and so on?
Yeah. Okay. Good. I think it's originally philosophers would think that this is a conceptual question, but I'm increasingly thinking that this is a scientific question. Part of the reason was because in the beginning, when we started thinking about ownership, it was supposed to be a all or nothing kind of, either you own it or you disown it, that kind of thing. And then Manos Sarkiris did this bunch of experiments which seemed to indicate that the body model was absolutely crucial. You have a body model, 2 hands, 2 legs, and so on and so forth, and it needs to have some kind of corporeal form in order to be incorporated. And then for every claim that Manos made, Henrik Earson then counterexampled it with some fancy VR experiment. Manos said you have to have a left hand and a right hand, so then Earson did 2 right hands, and then Manos said 2 hands, and then Earson did 3 hands, 4 hands, 5 hands, and so on. And so it looks increasingly plastic, but still body related. Now, there's this guy, Bernard Homo, in Leiden, and he's done experiments where he wants to interpret the results as non-corporeal objects being incorporated based on some proxy measure. I don't like the interpretation of the experiments, and do you want to come in and describe the experiment?
Not about that experiment, something else, but wait.
But if someone could pull off these cases where you show some kind of in-between type cases, you would imagine a kind of prosthetic that is so recently there's some new prosthetics that look quite fancy but are not so leg or hand shaped. You could imagine some of these things with like Captain Hook implements or stuff like that. And they start becoming in between. They're a little bit like a tool, but you also have a defensive reaction. You can dip them into hot soup and stir and so on and so forth. You don't have, so you have a kind of more sensitive reaction depending on the case. You would defend it against certain kinds of threats, but not against other threats and so on and so forth. So if that's the case, then there will be a continuum. And there won't be a cutoff. But so far, the answer that you gave in our stead for tools is the answer that I would give. Simply that you don't have that kind of appropriate self-specificity for the case of tools such that you would have defensive reactions. So maybe in order to get things exactly right to handle those cases, we would need to say that some things are necessary, like an effective component, such that rules out the two cases, because we were a bit liberal in the specification of the plurality of experiences.
It's okay. I think it's found that. Did I say something to that?
You can say something to that, yeah. Oh.
Yeah, so briefly on this tool point.
Oh. Okay.
Go ahead, Christina. First go ahead, and I can just...
Okay, Christina, and then.
Okay, so I think there is such as a phantom instrument or phantom tool, and that thinks that there isn't phantom tool and there is phantom leg, because we haven't too many times we lose our legs or hand, but we have quite many times we use phantom. So, and we haven't phantom tool. Why? So, like, there is an idea that there are two kinds of schema, the short term and the long term. And when you put down the tool, then your whole system just retune and you haven't the extension. So the kind of extension which you have for skis and tools, they are temporary and they are very quick to get rid of and very quick to get. And your hand is not like that. And that might be that what you get with the hand is that big package, like that you even when you lose it, you feel that it's there. That is which goes with ownership, but with the tool is like an extreme flexibility which we have. But that doesn't rule out what Hong Yu said. So it's still possible that some of the features which the real hand has somehow still work out to the tool, but I think it wouldn't be the case that all the feature works out, and the reason for that because the use of the tool is temporary, and then the fake leg would be a more closer place to the hand, except if you take off every night.
Yeah, actually, just exactly along those lines. So it also depends on, I think, whether the tool is in use, because the way you define the self-significance is actually action significant, right, in a way, so that it's relevant to what I would do with it, like my behavior. So you might think, so I'm imagining myself as like, if you're, for example, having a race, and you're a mountain biker, right, you will be very protective of that mountain bike, because until you finish, right, there is no way of changing it, getting out of the trail. So when you're actually navigating around, right, you're not just protecting your body, but you will be protecting your tires as well during the action. But of course, if I'm sitting here and I'm just standing on it, and let's say I'm not racing at the moment, but some kind of threat comes, I can leave it and go. But if I am in the process of action and I'm using the tool, probably I will be much more protective of it, because I am using it, and whatever I'm doing is bound up with it. The same way in traffic, right? You also protect the car in a way, just like you protect your body.
But there are lots of cases where, of course, I pick up a tool precisely to do something that I wouldn't do with a part of my body. I stick a poker in the fire, or I whack something with little attention to whether it's going to damage the tool, but I would never whack it with my hand. And I use a tool exactly for that reason.
I
sort
know
of, it
that's
fits.
compatible
That
with
is
each other.
compatible.
Yeah.
Depends on
It's the same
exactly
tool.
depends on the action, right? So in that case, tool is used to protect the body, and it's one thing I do, of course. But sometimes I use the tools to achieve a certain task, and the tool might be necessary for the task, and then I might protect it as well. But the tool might be also a tool for protection. In the poking case, actually, it's not just for poking, it's poking without hurting my body, right? So in that case, yes, but it's already built into the function of the tool in that case, right, that you're not protecting it. But certainly you would not poke such a way that it will break so that you will be too close to fire and you will burn yourself. So you wouldn't want to break it. In that respect, you would protect it nevertheless, because otherwise it wouldn't do the function it does. So that's my idea. It depends on, right, the task at hand.
Lucas, behind you.
Sorry if it sounds kind of dull, but to my understanding, everything that we've talked about up to this point was starting with a certain database, even with the minimum it was IW, but still there was something that we can say that he had as a basic level to understand how to extend, so to speak, if we may say, the ownership of his self. But is it possible to speak of as such as self or ownership in that level of which we don't have any database, so to speak? Like, say, an example would be like a baby was born and immediately it was not conscious, not really up to the point that was still able to function in the bodily sense, but was not really functioning as the consciousness, if we might say again, and trying to make it understand the functions of, or by adding such tools, the functions of itself. Or is it possible if from the beginning we are learning this modeling of the self, so the extension of the body, we are experiencing it, and that is, I think, from what you were talking about, the body schema, that was giving the appropriate location, the spatial location of the body. So is it possible from the beginning, if we are to work with such infants, that they were additionally getting the illusion of something else, that they were included in the ownership of their body as well?
So, Jed is the developmentalist here. I don't know any studies on ownership for infants, but someone could just Google it.
I don't think it'd be ethical, would it?
No, I don't think they have.
My niece's first word was mine. She's a younger sibling, like this is quite common. It was just like mine.
Yeah, I mean, the ownership studies I know have started in preschool, and so but there's self-development studies, and so there's probably fairly clearly something happening around 6 months, 24 months, and then 4 years. And how you want to characterize the different types of self-developments going on, and then continuing, by the way, identity and so on. And so you could definitely there's definitely research on development of self, and then maybe by extension you can figure out what you're interested in with respect to ownership.
Are there any studies on self-movement and some other movement? Because you might think with infants, you can do these. You could do some studies, but even gaze time, do they?
Well, so they show the infants their own legs.
Yeah.
This is stuff at 6 months. Or something like that. They show their own legs, and they show them either in correspondence with their actual body, or they reverse it.
Yeah.
And the infants show a preferential looking, suggesting they can differentiate those.
Okay. Yeah. So
the one that fits the body, the one that doesn't fit the body.
6 months. It looks like
I think it's 6 months.
They've got some idea of this is
some minimal sense of self, but then of course they don't recognize themselves in the mirror until 18 to 24 months.
Mirror is third person.
Pardon me?
The mirror is third person, and I think ownership is first person.
It could be. I mean, for Piaget, the 2-year thing would be that's when the child has probably the minimal sense of self. For us, because for him the idea is at 2 years you've differentiated the world from your activity, and in that differentiation you now have a self-other differentiation. And so I don't know if you call that third person or not. I mean, Piaget didn't.
Elephants and crows are passing the test, so.
Right.
And he might not want to say they are self-conscious.
Yeah.
But you should look at maybe Rochar's book, I think.
Yeah.
His book goes through all these different stages. There's he doesn't discuss ownership, but there's a lot of stuff about contingencies and stuff like that. Development of self-will differentiation.
Okay, we have one last question.
Okay. I was interested, I would be interested in hearing your comments on a particular kind of example that I'm going to give. And this, I mean, would be interesting how you would interpret it in terms of ownership and also to some extent in terms of body schema. The kind of examples that I have in mind are the cases in which a group of people, they interact in a very collaborative fashion that has been learned and that has been drilled into them, probably. So you can think, for example, about a team of firefighters. You can think about, for example, a battalion of soldiers on the field. So there is a troupe of dancers. So you have this coordination, which already includes an expectation about movement that is not necessarily that of your own body. At the same time, you have, in this case, different people, different persons, and this is part of why it's interesting also to me, because it actually involves a supra-personal level. And at the same time, you get this visceral level of cooperation and visceral level of action that in some cases it can include, for example, sacrifice in the firefighter case or in the soldier's case, but that almost makes one think maybe the idea of ownership in that particular instant has been extended, at least for that case, to the body, to a greater kind of body. So basically my question is how you would interpret, how you would position such cases in terms of ownership and in terms also of the schema for a group of people that have been working for a long time together and thus developed this expectation of other person's movement, etc.
Okay, good. So I'm not one of these enactivists, so I'm not keen to sort of extend and enact. I'm a very classical philosopher trained in the British tradition, coming from
Very sensible.
Strawson. So I'm inclined to say that notion of ownership doesn't apply, but there's a very close plastic notion of you could define a notion based on the shape of the account that we've drawn, which would then be called system specificity. Let's define a notion of system specificity. So we abstract. And in some cases the system is the self, some cases the system is the group. And then you could define the notions correspondingly based on the notion of system specificity. And then you could ask the questions whether you have system-specific affects, system-specific defensive responses, system-specific spatial responses, and so on and so forth. So in that way it could be applied. And then in the action case, I don't think you need the apparatus of the ownership in order to deal with that. So if you look at recent work, both psychological and philosophical, there is evidence that when you do joint actions, you represent the action plans of your partners to some degree. So Natalie Sabans and her lab have done studies about handshaking and stuff like that, EEG studies. And so for example, when I put my hand out to Jed and then he puts his hand out, and the peak of the signal that we are interested in is already there before he sticks his hand out. So he's already representing what's happening. So there you can see that this is happening. And philosophically, Stephen Butterfield has tried to develop that as a very important aspect of joint action, that you need to have shared motor representations. So a lot of philosophers have developed the level of shared intentions, people like Bratman, or joint coordinated intentions, or Searle has just gone totally over the top and invented re-intentions and stuff like that. But you could imagine that you have interlocked representations based on, so you could have different levels of accounts. You could have shared motor representations of sorts that has received psychological support, and then say you either have or don't have shared intentions, and so on and so forth. And if you find the evidence for re-intentions convincing, then you go for re-intentions too. So there's quite a lot of apparatus that you can use there in order to capture the idea of the unity of a system and its ability to perceive and act and react together.
But of course, also an interesting part of it is kind of the subpersonal, almost like a subpersonal level can be so strong even in a group reaction, because I can imagine that the firefighter that is doing something selfless from a perspective of just an individual person, they would not probably represent it to themselves in such a way. It would function, as you said, as a system defense, as a group defense. But this coordination, it's not just the level of you're representing somebody else's action, but there is something else going on there, almost.
Agree.
Yeah, if you're interested in this, next Friday we have another workshop, and part of it is going to be about re-intentions, who weren't actually invented by Searle, but by sellers.
Sellers.
Yeah. So we've got a talk by Jeremy Coons, who's a sellers expert, Bill Ringer, who works on collective obligations and collective agency, and Ken Westphal on something to do with Hegel, society and action. So if you're interested in collective action stuff, that's next week. Okay, let's thank our speaker. And it was a really productive day. We're now going to go to